All right, so evolution is the model that the atheists, the naturalists have to use to explain the universe, and yet we're showing that it's got more than just minor problems. It's got major problems at the fundamental level. So in our last session, we started looking at this idea, the evidence that they claim proves their position. And in order for evolution to even be scientific, it needs to have scientific evidence. In order for it to be rational, it has to have sufficient evidence to draw that conclusion that evolution is true. And so they will generally point to these same evidences over and over and over. They have for years and years and years. And so we went through, or we are going through these, and we got up into the fossil evidence and have been looking at that. And so I want to look a little bit more at the fossil evidence in this session, and then we'll jump into the dating methods in the next session. So what about the fossil record? This area of alleged evidence is proclaimed perhaps the loudest and with the worst attitude, the most arrogant attitude that I've seen among the evolutionists. Doesn't the fossil record indicate that humans evolved from some ape-like ancestor? I ran across this chart. Evolution, we have the fossils, we win. So who are they fighting against? Who do they win against? They're talking about us. And so they claim the fossil record proves it, it ends the battle, it's over, they win. And so that's what we're going to look at and see whether that actually is legitimate. Keep in mind that they don't claim that we evolved from an ape. Okay, they would say we evolved from an ape-like ancestor, and the apes came from them too. So make sure you're clear on the terminology there. The apes are like our cousin, okay? And so they would say there was a common ancestor between both of us, and it was ape-like. All right, so let's go ahead and look at what the actual evidence says. I could spend a lot of time on this subject. I wish I had more time to talk about just the entire fossil record in general, because I would argue the fossil record is probably, I would say, the best argument for creation and against evolution. I just think it's such a strong argument because it so fits our predictions and it so falsifies the evolutionary predictions. But for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to handle it that way. Let's think about, first of all, what would we predict, what would we expect to find in the fossil record if evolution is true? If the literal account of creation in Genesis 1 is true, that God just directly created the distinct kinds of animals, then we would expect an absence of transitional forms linking those animals to previous life forms and so forth, back to the original single-celled creature. In other words, there shouldn't be creatures in the fossil record or still living that are part, say, pig, part zebra or something, and there shouldn't be creatures that are half ape and half human. Instead, if the creation model is true, the fossil record should show from the beginning fully functional, distinct types of creatures the first time they appear in fossilized form. They shouldn't just be simple when they're lower. They can be simple or complex. It's all going to be mixed up. And there's some other predictions we can make about that. But if evolution is true, if there has been gradual transformations in kinds of life throughout millions of years, then there should be evidence of those gradual changes, as Darwin argued for. There should be a large number of transitional ape-like creature to human creatures in between there. And you would expect there even to be creatures alive today like that. And evolutionists realize and admit the fossil record should reveal transitional forms. The problem is that evidence is not there. Darwin himself realized that way back when he wrote The Origin of Species. The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links, right? Because there should be billions of these. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory, talking about evolution. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. So he's going to believe in evolution, and he acknowledges the fossil record doesn't support it, And he's just going to say, well, I think it's just because the geological record just didn't do a good job of preserving the truth of this theory. And so he hoped, give it a few more decades and we'll find the evidence that'll substantiate it, right? That's what he hoped for. Well, probably the leading evolutionary paleontologist of the 20th century, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard. Notice what he said. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design. Okay, major transitions in organic design. He's talking about, you got this creature here, this ape, and you got this, or this ape-like creature, and you got this human over here. Okay, so major transitions in organic design. There's an absence of evidence for intermediary stages between these major transitions in organic design. The absence of that, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases. They can't even make up something that would fit, that would bridge the gap there in their, not even evidence, but just make something up in your mind. That has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So this has been, here he is writing over 100 years after Darwin came up with his theory, and he's acknowledging this is still a major problem, and it's not only persistent, it's nagging. Why would it be nagging to him? Well, because as a logical person, you're thinking, okay, I believe in evolution, and so there's going to be evidence of that in the fossil record, these transitional forms, and it's going to keep nagging at you the fact that that evidence never does come to light. Do they believe it anyway, even though there's not the evidence of it? Yeah, so once again, what do we have here? We have a blind faith. We have irrational belief in this idea. Notice what he said. All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups, again, are characteristically abrupt. You got this creature here, and we think it turned into this one. But there's no evidence of it. There's just an abrupt change. You got this creature, boom, you got this creature. So there's no transitional forms. They're not there. There seems to be these clear distinctions between the types of creatures, which is exactly what we would predict should be the case if biblical creation is true. That is a prediction we would make. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms, okay? And keep in mind that when he says extreme rarity, there is not such a thing as a transitional form that they all agree with. So what we're talking about is transitional forms that are highly contentious even among the evolutionists. And even those are extremely rare, and I could talk about that a lot too, because they inevitably, for example, end up being vertebrate species, but the bulk of the fossil record, over 99% of the fossil record, is invertebrate species. And so if evolution is true, you should see evidence of it among the invertebrates, which fossilize way better than the vertebrate species, and yet there is no such transitional fossil they'll even point to among the invertebrates. That's why the fossil record is a powerful argument for us, not them, and yet here they proclaim it as though they win over that issue. So he says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks, okay, young people, when you see the textbook, you got these evolutionary trees. Are those legit? He says, they have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the what? Not the evidence of the fossils. So when you look at these evolutionary trees in the textbook, which seem like, oh man, see, all this proves evolution. He's coming out and saying, as the leading paleontologist, by the way, Harvard guy, he says what you actually have is you picture these trees and you have the nodes in the tips of the branches. The stuff in here that says that this turned into this, that's not there. That's inference. It's not the actual evidence. So in other words, we infer that this turned into that. Why do you infer that? Well, because we believe in evolution. So it's circular reasoning. It's not proved. They just blindly believe it, even though there's no evidence that that can happen. There's not even a mechanism for that to happen. David B. Kitts, the late evolutionary geologist, paleontologist, professor of geology and the history of science, actually at Oklahoma University, he said, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it's presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists. the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. So if evolution were true, the fossil record should abound with these transitional forms, but they're just not there. And so, seemingly in a state of panic, evolutionists will find a few bones every now and then, and they tend to be very quick to claim, hey, here we go, there's a missing link. And whether or not they're doing it because they're panic, a lot of times they're doing it because they just want to make a buck. It's very popular if you can find fossils that you could claim to be possibly transitional. But the minute that the other people get in there and look at the evidence, among the evolutionists themselves, they throw each other under the bus and say, no, this isn't a transitional fossil. But the secret they don't announce too loudly is that they've hardly found anything at all to start with. By the way, notice he says, Gould had said, the extreme rarity of fossil forms, this is the trade secret of paleontology. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means is everybody thinks we have the fossil record, we win. They think it's over. It's already been established. It's a trade secret of paleontology. Hardly anybody has a paleontology degree that is not a devout, and I use that term because it's a religious term, and that's what we're talking about here, that is not a devout evolutionist. And they don't broadcast very loudly this fact. You got to dig into their literature. Who's reading natural history? That's a heavily evolutionary journal. Unless you're a creationist reading it to show you what they're teaching, hardly anybody's going to look at this. So it's a trade secret. They don't announce this loudly, the truth about this issue. Stephen Jay Gould, in fact, well, I'll talk about this later. Stephen Jay Gould, it really bothered him, the fact that they don't have an answer to this problem. But I'll talk about that again a little bit later. All right, notice what Richard Lewontin, here's a research professor at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, according to their website, considered one of their most brilliant evolutionary biologists. He said the main problem is the poor fossil record. Despite a handful of hominid fossils stretching back 4 million years or so, we can't be sure that any of them are on the main ancestral line to us. Many of them could have been evolutionary side branches. All right, so here they find some stuff. They think maybe this is transitional form, but they can't be sure that any of them are actually between us and the supposed common ancestor. They may be branches over here that aren't even in our ancestry. That's what they're saying. Kate Wong, evolutionist, senior science writer for Scientific American. The origin of our genus, Homo, is based on meager evidence, she said. Mariette de Christina, editor-in-chief of Scientific American. Pieces of our ancient forebears generally are hard to come by, however. Scientists working to interpret our evolution often have had to make do with studying a fossil toe bone here or a jaw there. So very meager evidence, toe bones and jaw bones, and we'll look at later about why that's a house of cards to be using that kind of scant evidence. But that's what they have to work with, and so you'd think with so little to go on, they might be prone to making mistakes a lot. And that is exactly what you see in the literature. Based on their own words, the proof of human evolution is already based on meager evidence, and that evidence, without exception, is either debatable among the evolutionists themselves, which is why they're constantly throwing each other under the bus, or worse, the evidence ends up being a flat-out hoax or a major blunder after the claims are investigated further by others. So, for example, we have a parade of these kind of instances. In 2009, a fossilized skeleton was discovered and given the name Ida. The media and evolutionists were quick to dub Ida as a missing link, a transitional fossil, one of our ancestors. The Norwegian fossil scientist of the Oslo Natural History Museum that was the co-discoverer of Ida, he said, this is the first link to all humans, truly a fossil that links world heritage. Naturalist David Attenborough said, the little creature is going to show us our connection with all the rest of the mammals. The link they would have said until now is missing. It's no longer missing. Boom, there it is. We got it. No more missing link. Which, by the way, the silliness of that is there actually has to be billions of these transitional. It's not just one missing link. There's billions, but we'll talk about that later. So anyway, a year and a half later, after other scientists had examined Ida, evolutionary anthropologists Blythe William and Richard Kay of Duke University, Chris Kirk, associate professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, and evolutionary biologist Callum Ross, University of Chicago. They announced the findings of their own research on Ida. And what did they find? Well, they said Ida is not an evolutionary missing link between humans and ape-like creature at all, as was claimed. So what was she, according to them? Well, apparently Ida was just merely a forebearer of modern-day lemurs and lorises, which you can look and see. That fits a lot better, doesn't it? What about Neanderthal man? You've heard of Neanderthal man, very famous missing link fossils that supposed to be a primitive ancestor of humans back towards the ape-like creature, dumb cavemen type guys, which we do have a lot of those today, so maybe there's something to that. Anyway, as Eric Trinkhaus, evolutionary anthropologist of Washington University in St. Louis, one of the world's foremost authorities on the Neanderthals, he concluded detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. So Neanderthal man was not primitive. There wasn't any distinguishing thing about Neanderthal man that would make him seem anything other than human. And on top of that, admittedly modern human fossils have been found near the remains of the Neanderthals that have been dated as being older than the alleged dates of the Neanderthals. So how could modern humans have evolved from the Neanderthals if the Neanderthals date to a time after modern humans already came along? And then there's the recent research by the team that was sequencing the Neanderthal genome. And so they sequenced it, and here's what they found. The leader of the team, Ed Green, assistant professor of biomolecular engineering at UC Santa Cruz, he said this concerning Neanderthal DNA. He said, 2 chimpanzees are roughly as different in DNA sequence as a human and a Neanderthal. Okay, so if you took 2 modern admitted chimpanzees and you compared their DNA is not going to match exactly. Okay, there's going to be some differences even among the chimpanzees themselves. He said that same amount of difference you see that between modern humans and Neanderthals. What does that tell you? 2 chimpanzees, 2 humans, right? Neanderthals are just human, according to the genetic evidence too. Back in 1891, evolutionists found fossilized teeth, the upper part of a skull, and a thigh bone on the banks of the Solo River in the Dutch Indies, and assumed they were from some kind of transitional creature. And so from these few bones, evolutionists presumptuously drew what they thought the creature would have looked like and called it Java Man. Isn't it amazing that you can take just a few teeth, a bit of a skull, and a thigh bone and figure out what a man's anatomy looked like to this degree? That's amazing, right? Well, you can't do that, and yet that doesn't stop the wild claims. Over time, scientists discovered that the leg bone and teeth were actually from a human. The skull cap was from a monkey. A few years after this find, while Java Man was still famous, 1926, Professor Eberlein of the Dutch Medical Service found what he thought was a complete cranium in the same area that Java Man had been discovered, and seemingly like the alleged Java Man skulls. They thought they had more proof of this transitional species. Again, the fossil was hailed as more evidence of this, and it took a year. Time ran a retraction in 1927, and in the retraction, the Smithsonian Institute said that the cranium was actually the kneecap of an elephant. So no transitional creature here. 1912, a doctor found a jawbone and a portion of a skull in a gravel pit in England and assumed that the fossils were from a transitional creature they called Piltdown Man. And so from that scant evidence, they made a skull to show what they thought the transitional creature's head would have looked like. Well, this time it took decades. It wasn't until 1953 that the Piltdown Man was found to be an actual fake. It was a fraud. The skull fossil was found to be from a modern human, and the jawbone was from an ape, and the fossilized teeth had been filed down and treated chemically to make it look older than it was. So no transitional fossil there. 1922, newspapers printed a picture of male and female human-like creatures that they had drawn based on one fossil tooth that they found, which they claimed was from a prehistoric transitional creature, pre-human type guy. Isn't it amazing what you can come up with about the physical form of a creature from one tooth? Not even all the tooth. This is actually just different shots of the same tooth from different perspectives, right? As it was not even all the tooth. Writing in Science magazine, Michael Balter discusses his interview with anthropologist Adrian Zillman of the University of California, Santa Cruz, who highlighted some eye-opening practices among those evolutionists that are working to sort out human evolution. She said, it says, in her view, much of the work that human evolution researchers do today is based on conjecture as well as hard science. The paleoartists, Zillman told Science, are doing what the rest of us do. Most of what we do is part art, part science. So what's the percentage then? How much of it's art, how much of it's science? When you're talking about one tooth, okay, then you got a lot of art going on here, okay? And that is what we see going on. Well, they've been extremely influential with their pictures, but they don't tell you the truth underlying this. In their defense, they're drawing pictures to show you, based on their model, what they think this creature would have looked like at this time. But you got to keep in mind, that's not proof that it looked like that. That is their inference based on their model. If their model's wrong, you would interpret it totally differently. That's the problem. Well, the creature they came up with, they called Nebraska man, also called Hesperopithecus. Guess what? Within 5 years, scientists decided that the tooth was actually from a wild pig, not a transitional creature. All right, next. Another example of the dangers of paleoartists taking liberties, Hobbit Man. 2004, paleontologists digging on the small Indonesian island of Flores discovered a few bones from 7 different individuals that hadn't even yet completely fossilized. The most complete individual, labeled LB1 there on the screen, consisted of most of the skull as well as some of the legs, hands, feet, pelvis bones, and it was thought to be a species of its own and given the Latin name Homo floresiensis. The media called it Hobbit Man because he was thought to be only 3.5 feet tall. Michael Lemonick, writing in Time magazine, said, what makes the discovery truly shocking is that the beings were not, like the pygmies of equatorial Africa, just a short variety of modern Homo sapiens. Dubbed Homo floresiensis, they represent an entirely new twig on the human family tree. The chapter of biology textbooks that describes our family tree will have to be rewritten, and they were. Over the next decade, floresiensis started appearing in biology textbooks and life science textbooks. Well, guess what? It was in 2014, other scientists jumped in there and said, wait a minute, we need to reassess what's going on here. The Huffington Puffington Post began their announcement of the latest studies of the fossils with this line: were scientists all wrong about prehistoric hobbits? They thought they had a new species on their hands with Homo floresiensis, but new studies indicated that the skull that affected their interpretation may have been merely a modern human with Down syndrome. And so when measurements were taken of the thigh bone, skull circumference, and cranial volume, and compared to the previous figures, the bones are found to fall in the typical range of modern humans that have Down syndrome. Professor of Developmental Genetics and Evolution at Penn State, one of the authors of one of the studies, Robert Eckhart, he said the difference is significant and the revised figure falls in the range predicted for a modern human with Down syndrome from the same geographic region. So apparently, according to these guys, Hobbit Man is just a modern man. And in the words of Matthew Cobb, professor of zoology at the University of Manchester, writing in New Scientist, he said, it's embarrassing but true. Some of the most influential drawings in the history of biology are wrong, exaggerated to fit a thesis. The remains of Rhodesian man were found in a zinc mine in 1921 and displayed at the British Museum of Natural History for years. But the fossilized hips had been crushed, which caused the displayers to portray the creature at the time as stooped over. Once again, years later, when actual anatomists examined the fossils, this was found to be merely a modern human being as well. July 1866, Josiah Whitney, the head of California's Geological Survey, unveiled his discovery of a skull that had been found in Calaveras County, presenting a paper to the California Academy of Natural Sciences. And it was discovered in a mine shaft beneath volcanic deposits that were believed to be 1 million years old, which would make the skull the oldest known human-like being on the continent at the time. And it looked, though, very much like the skull of a Native American, a modern Native American, and yet it's supposed to be over 1 million years old. William Holmes, a Smithsonian archaeologist, said, quote, to suppose that man could have remained unchanged physically, to suppose that he could have remained unchanged mentally, socially, industrially, and aesthetically for 1 million years, roughly speaking, is to suppose a miracle. So either the skull is extremely old, in proof that evolution didn't happen over 1 million years, which would disprove evolution, because according to evolution, things evolve, because it's so similar to modern humans, well, that wouldn't have happened. Or it's young and therefore disproves the dating methods that they're using to date the volcanic deposit, and therefore it's not even a candidate for an ancient evolutionary ancestor at all. But regardless, Calaveras man's ultimately irrelevant, because then it was determined to be a hoax as well, supposedly planted by local miners in the mine for Whitney to find, because they wanted to trip him up because they didn't like Whitney. So not good for evolutionists. Now keep in mind that many evolutionists themselves acknowledge these blunders and hoaxes. I'm not just making this up. Here's what famous skeptic Michael Shermer, how he put it. He said, hoaxes like Piltdown Man and honest mistakes like Nebraska Man, Calaveras Man, and Hesperopithecus are in time exposed. In fact, it was not creationists who exposed these errors. It was scientists who did so. Anybody notice something kind of obnoxious about that statement? Creationists aren't scientists, right? Well, okay, whatever. But I do notice, though, he's saying they're the ones that actually came up with this. We're not just making this up. They themselves are acknowledging these massive blunders. Well, Calaveras man's not proof of evolution. Carbon dating in 1992 indicated the skull was actually about 1,000 years old. And yet, guess what? There's still going to be those out there that will hold on to Calaveras man as proof of evolution. Heidelberg man, Homo heidelbergensis, was originally based off of a single lower jawbone, pictured there on the left, and compared to a regular modern-day human jawbone. Heidelberg man was recognized by the guy that found him, Daniel Hartman, to be very human-like, like a modern human, and so he knew that he belonged at least in the genus Homo, but notice that it's really big, apparently too big for Hartman to consider it to be Homo sapiens, and it's found deeper in the geologic column. So according to Donald Johanson, American paleoanthropologist and discoverer of the Lucy fossils, Hartman decided to go ahead and give him a special name and put him in a species of his own, in spite of the fact that it was very similar to a human jawbone. Well, Mr. Hartman, just because it's bigger, it doesn't mean it's not human. I'd kind of like to see what Andre the Giant's jawbone or Goliath's jawbone would have looked like up next to a modern human jawbone. That may be exactly what you're seeing here. 1979, what appeared to be a collarbone was found at a site named Sahabi in Libya, and some scientists believed it belonged to this primitive ape man. And after further investigation, the collarbone was found not to be a collarbone, but a rib from a sea mammal very similar to a dolphin. All right, so you're noticing how hard it is for the evolutionists to try to find these transitional forms. You would think if evolution happened, it wouldn't be so hard to find the fossil evidence of it. Orsay man in the 1980s, a portion of a skull cap, was found near the Spanish village of Orsay, and evolutionists once again were quick to announce that this fragment was from an ancient human child. And so from that small fragment, they constructed an entire human they called Orsay man. Later, the bone was conceded as likely being the skull cap of a 6-month-old donkey. Handyman, or Homo habilis, is the creature that Lucy supposedly evolved into, which is, there's a big debate over what in the world this guy is, whether creationist or evolutionist. Nobody even knows. It seems to be a hodgepodge of fossils that nobody knows what to do with. But anyway, evolutionists will construct these models and paintings without sufficient evidence and grandiosely speculate and conjecture. A fairly, what they think is maybe a complete fossil skeleton of Handyman was discovered that indicated this creature was probably just an ape, in no way related to man at all. The skeleton of Handyman is just as primitive as Lucy, which is supposedly 2 million years older than Handyman, if evolution is true. So if evolution were true, then in 2 million years worth of time, you should expect to see significant progress in evolving towards man, and yet Lucy is just as primitive as Handyman. So that can't be argued to be a missing link. What about the elusive Peking man? In the 1920s and 30s, a few fossils were discovered near Beijing, China, and evolutionists were quick to call the fossils transitional forms and proof of evolution once again, and they dated the fossils to be from 300,000, 800,000 years ago, but scientists found conflicting evidence at the same site. In 1933, several fossils of admittedly modern humans were also discovered, and they're not supposed to be on the scene yet with the evolutionary model. Well, bottom line, they'll never know, because within a few years, 1941, the fossils went mysteriously missing. Gao Xing, a paleontologist and member of the working committee to search for the lost skull caps of Peking man, believe it or not, there's a committee to search for these lost skulls, and he said, quote, "We don't know where the bones are. They may well have been destroyed, but we have to look," is what he said. I think it's just ironic how the more evolution is examined, the more its evidence continues to go missing. Cro-Magnon man, what's all the talk about this guy? Is he proof of evolution? Well, evolutionists themselves acknowledge that Cro-Magnons were the first creatures with a skeleton that looked completely modern anatomically, and then recent research by a team of European geneticists from the universities of Ferrara and Florence showed that a Cro-Magnon man who lived in southern Italy, supposedly 28,000 years ago, was a modern European genetically as well. Okay, so if it looked like us anatomically and it is like us genetically, then what's the difference? If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, in this case it bleeds like a duck, it's a duck. So this isn't a missing link either. Cro-Magnon man is just a man, a human. But I do notice this pattern: quick claims that evidence has been found, time passes, further study, investigation, retractions have to be made over and over and over. You'd think that people would notice the pattern and accept the truth, but the problem is this isn't about the evidence. It never has been about the evidence. It's about a blind faith belief in evolution because people want an alternative to creation. Lee Berger, paleoanthropologist at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. This is maybe the leading paleontologist today because he's responsible for finding Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi. Those are the two big fossil finds from the last 10 years. Writing in Scientific American, he chided the standard practice in paleontology that is going on today, where they try to draw too much information from these single isolated bones, okay? The sediba fossils that he found, the skeletons he found, were more complete than the typical fossil finds by far, even though they weren't even 50% complete skeletons. But he made the point that if any of the bones that he had in his skeletons had been found isolated, which is typically the scenario in fossil finds, these isolated bones, but if any of his bones had been found isolated, paleontologists would have drawn completely different conclusions about the skeletal anatomy. And so he said, sediba shows that one can no longer assign isolated bones to a genus. About time. We would say that we've been saying that a long time. They are making mountains out of molehills. They don't have enough evidence to argue what they're arguing about any of the stuff they're finding. Bernard Wood, paleoanthropologist and professor at George Washington University, as well as adjunct senior scientist at the National Museum of Natural History. He said, Berger's absolutely right, that isolated bones do not predict what the rest of the animal looks like. All right, now is it likely that people are going to listen to Wood and Berger? No way, because the vast majority of the hominid fossil finds that allegedly prove human evolution are based on isolated bones like that. So what's going on here with these fossils and blunders? What's going on in the hearts of the evolutionary community that is causing these mistakes to happen? Well, keep in mind, again, if evolution predicts there to be transitional forms, then they're expecting to find them. And so they just assume that that is what it is very quickly. And so as human or ape-like fossils have surfaced, then they are kind of recklessly quick to make the assumption that it is what they're hoping it is. And they'll tend to become famous when they find something like that. And then sure enough, later on, others investigate it and they're like, I don't know about that. So Michael Shermer, notice what he says about this. He said, if you want to get your fossil find published in Science or Nature and you want the cover illustration, you cannot conclude that your fossil is yet another Australopithecus africanus, for example. You had better come up with an interpretation indicating that this new find you're revealing to the world for the first time is the most spectacular discovery of the last century, and that it promises to overturn hominid phylogeny and send everyone back to the drawing board to reconfigure the human evolutionary tree. Training a more skeptical eye on the fossils, however, shows that many of them belong in already well-established categories. Name diversity does not equal biological diversity, Tim White elucidated. So by the time people realize the error in these finds, it's already been spread far and wide, assumed to be true. And trying to fix the error with everyone who's bought into the lie seems to be nearly impossible, again, because so many people are wanting to find evidence of this, and they're expecting to find it, and so they're going to be quick to assume that. Science textbooks, of course, often miss the memo altogether or ignore it and continue to publish these terrible finds as proof of evolution for years and years to come. Well, writing in Science Digest, Lyle Watson, well-known evolutionary biologist and zoologist, he said, "The fossils that decorate our family tree are so scarce that there are still more scientists than specimens. The remarkable fact is that all the physical evidence we have for human evolution can still be placed with room to spare inside a single coffin," which I think is ironic because it does spell death for the evolutionary model. So what's in the coffin today that they still are holding on to? If you were to open up a biology textbook and turn to the section on mammals and specifically primate evolution, you're probably going to see a chart that maybe either looks like something like this. This is the way that historically it's been laid out. It's kind of a single timeline like this. The idea being to help you see what evolutionists believe the family ancestry of humans is back to some ape-like ancestor. Each one of these red boxes represents a species in the period of time that the evolutionists believe those species lived in the past, based, of course, on the evolutionary timeline in millions of years. So each one of these species is supposed to be an ancestor of Homo sapiens, right? So species that eventually evolved into other species that eventually evolved into humans. Now, some have started to draw the chart. In fact, most seem to be moving this direction where they draw the chart more like a bush instead of a line, because a line would suggest that they're in our direct ancestry, but now they're acknowledging more and more that one by one each of these creatures isn't in our direct line, and therefore they didn't evolve into man, and instead they're pulling them out and putting them on side branches to make them more like cousins instead of in our direct ancestry. Now, all that does, of course, is make it worse for the evolutionary model, because every one of those species is one less supposed missing link that they can try to use. And they've now moved the bulk of the Australopithecines now over onto their own branch. And so there is nothing connecting the humans with the supposed ancestor. Now, of course, as you've seen in the quotes already, evolutionists over the last several decades have openly admitted that they really don't have much to work with, and then what they do have can't be used as conclusive proof of human evolution. Why is that? Well, there's several reasons, but one big one is because of what is not on this chart. Okay, so even if all of these species were on the evolutionary timeline, the ancestry of humans, it still wouldn't really prove evolution, and here's why. Each of these boxes, again, is supposed to represent a particular species with its own particular traits, traits that make it distinctly different from the other species. These aren't just little differences, these are clear distinctions between these species, which incidentally is what we would predict to be the case in creation. So in between each distinct species, there should be thousands of other species with minute changes that link each of those species. Those species would have transitional characteristics somewhere between the other existing species. All right, question, where are they? Where's all those species? I mean, that is a lot of missing species. And remember that there should be billions of transitional fossils. We're talking representatives of each of these missing species as well as representatives of every other species on the planet and all of their transitional forms to their common ancestors. And that is just not what we have. We have a handful of fossils from individual distinct species that already have fully formed traits, and even among the evolutionists themselves cannot be conclusively known to be what they hope it is. It's as though all of these creatures were just created and planted on the earth, already in their fully formed state, exactly as the creation model would predict. Well, this list on the screen summarizes that previous chart. The alleged species in our ancestry that are exhibited in textbooks and magazines, at least by the evolutionists who haven't completely given up on the fossil record in proving evolution. If you survey the literature on fossil finds, one thing you're going to notice is that evolutionists don't agree with each other on the timeline of human evolution and what even belongs in the tree and what doesn't. In fact, their vehement disagreement with each other over this matter is proof that the fossil record doesn't prove anything conclusively, which explains the quotes that I've already showed you where many paleontologists admit the fossil record doesn't substantiate evolution at all. But this chart is a reasonable assessment of the scientific literature concerning the fossil record and what the evolutionists believe to be the family tree of man, from this ape-like creature to Homo sapiens. So biology textbooks will typically have a listing of these fossils and their portrayals of the human evolutionary tree. And so a few of the more recent finds haven't trickled down to the textbooks yet. Homo naledi, Australopithecus sediba, and Homo dmanisi. And we could go through each of those. I actually have replicas of most of these at AP. I have skulls of most of these. But it gets tedious, and so I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of that. Cluster analysis reveals that each one of these can be reasonably shown to be either a variety of human or a total non-human, with the Australopithecines clumping together as their own group, separate from the Homo varieties. So in general, the Homo species can all be considered variety of human. And so there's no evidence that the humans evolved from a non-human. The necessary links that would connect humans to that supposed ancestor are non-existent. Even the Australopithecines are now being acknowledged to belong on a separate side branch of the human evolutionary tree. They aren't our ancestors. I was actually in DC at the National Natural History Museum there, and that's how they're depicting it now. They got the Australopithecines over on its own side branch. It's not even in our lineage. So the missing links between this alleged ape-like ancestor and human beings is just not there. So no wonder, in their more candid moments, evolutionists will admit as much. In fact, I was just reading this year, again, Bernard Wood. This was an American scientist, and the title of the article, The Inevitably Incomplete Story of Human Evolution. Not only is human evolution incomplete, it's inevitable that it'll be complete. They've totally just embraced this now and just coming out and saying it's inevitable. We're not going to be able to give you the story here. So Bernard Wood, again, and his, also with paleoanthropologist, his colleague there, Alexis Alutku of George Washington University. Notice what they said here. Reconstructing that braided rope of human evolutionary lineage would be a scientific challenge in any case, but it is all the more difficult because of major gaps in the fossil record, right? So we still have these major gaps today, all right? And so notice that, this has been the case all the way back to Darwin, right? And they warn all modern paleoanthropologists that the existing human fossil record is incomplete in almost all respects, with little chance that any narrative explanation offered today can be the right one. Isn't that amazing? There's little chance that we're right. None of the narratives are going to be right about this. You ever get the impression that evolution has been proven as fact? That the fossil record at the very least proves it? Well, no wonder when you see charts like the one I showed you earlier. But Wood and Alutku warned that creationists have responded to those claims and capitalized on evolutionary paleoanthropologists' blunders over the years, right? Which is what we just did. And so they explain accounts based on incomplete data sets can sometimes misleadingly sound definitive. Okay, well, yeah, it's definitely misleading. In other words, the public is led by who? Well, evolutionary paleontologists. The public is led to believe the fossil record proves human evolution, but it doesn't. The public has been misled on that subject, according to him, according to Bernard Wood himself. All right, they continue. It is accepted practice in paleoanthropology to present detailed reconstructions of human evolutionary history that rarely acknowledge the extent to which they are incomplete and bound to change. Okay? It's true. They rarely acknowledge that, right? But this practice does a disservice to all concerned. It would be more helpful as well as more accurate to acknowledge that the hominin fossil record is incomplete and that there are therefore limits to what can be said about it. You know, it's actually very refreshing to hear one of these leading paleoanthropologists actually come out and finally admit, we've been right all this time. This is what we've been saying. And they're finally coming out acknowledging it. They have led the public to believe evolution is a proven fact, and they use the fossil record as their trump card. But here we have leading paleoanthropologists coming out and warning everybody, guys, that's actually not been true. There's major gaps in the record. We're almost guaranteed to be wrong in our interpretation. There's limits to what we can say with the evidence we found. Well, I tell you, my respect for Wood and those like him increased drastically because of his honesty, his transparency about that. But few are like him, and they're not going to make those admissions. Well, Colin Patterson is the paleontologist who serves as the editor of the professional journal published by the British Museum of Natural History in London. He literally wrote the textbook on evolution. And somebody wrote in and said, what's the deal with the fact that you don't have examples of transitional fossils in your book that prove evolution? And he said in response, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. How about that for an admission? So according to Colin Patterson, there are no transitional fossils, and he's just citing the leaders, the American Museum of Natural History. He's citing Gould. Wouldn't it be nice if all evolutionists would make that admission and scrap their bias against creation and scrap the theory of evolution? They're not going to, because this is not about the evidence. The evidence is clear. Kate Wong, evolutionist and senior science writer for Scientific American, she said, for decades, paleoanthropologists have combed remote corners of Africa on hand and knee for fossils of Homo's earliest representatives. Their efforts have brought only modest gains, a jawbone here, handful of teeth there, right, which are always controversial and not even enough to prove evolution. Most of the recovered fossils instead belong to either ancestral Australopithecines or later members of Homo, creatures too advanced to illuminate the order in which our distinctive traits arose. With so little to go on, the origin of our genus has remained as mysterious as ever. So evolutionists themselves acknowledge we don't have much, and the whole lineage is mysterious. We don't know what happened. And again, you don't even know if it was evolution, because you can't prove it with the evidence you have. You got major gaps. Lord Solly Zuckerman, famous zoologist, anatomist, British scientific advisor, as well as professor at Oxford, after he studied the Australopithecines for over 15 years, he admitted years ago, if man did descend from an ape-like ancestor, he did so without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of that transformation. And again, that is certainly still the case. Lee Berger, all right, he acknowledged the fossil record is inadequate in showing the evolution of humans. He said, we really need a better record, and it's out there. Notice the blind faith, right? That's just wishful thinking. That's what Darwin thought too. At what point do you acknowledge, I have a blind faith, I need to switch to something that's actually based on evidence? At what point do you do that? Well, I don't think you ever do if you've made this a religious zeal. Like if you've made a decision that you just will not accept creation, then it doesn't matter. You're going to keep pushing this stuff. Mark Ridley, evolutionary zoologist of Oxford, he said, you know, if you're a real evolutionist, no real evolutionist, whether gradualistic or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. In other words, if you really know your stuff, you're not going to try to use the fossil record against a creationist. You will lose. That's what will happen. Because the creationist, if he knows his stuff, he knows the fossil record is on his side. You don't want to bring that up in a debate. All right, so the fossil record doesn't support evolution, so why not give it up? Well, again, they're firmly committed to naturalism, no God allowed. And so rather than give it up, some, like perhaps the leading paleontologist of the 20th century, Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, he gave up on Darwinian evolution and started accepting a different form because he acknowledged, look, I'm studying the fossil record, I'm the leading paleontologist, and it doesn't support Darwin. But I don't want to accept God. I still want to accept evolution. I need something different. And he spent his life trying to figure this out, come up with an explanation. The Cambrian explosion really bothered him. We'll talk about that later. So in the fossil record, we see this creature here, and then we see this distinctly different creature here with no transitional forms connecting them. But we need to believe that this one turned into this one, if evolution is true, even though there's no proof of it. Gradual evolution would provide evidence for that, but it's not there. Okay, so maybe evolution happens really fast in spurts. Interpunctuated equilibrium. So Ridley here mentions punctuationists. So these are evolutionists who have ultimately admitted the fossil record doesn't support Darwinian evolution. It doesn't help us. So instead of throwing out the theory of evolution and admitting creationists are right, they believe evolution happens quickly in spurts, not gradually. And so the theory is that most of the time life on the earth is in a state of equilibrium, very little change. But those periods of equilibrium are punctuated by periods of rapid evolution, punctuated equilibrium. I call it magical equilibrium because that's what it amounts to. It's evidenceless superstition like witchcraft. So those periods that are punctuated with rapid evolution occur so quickly, they say, that the fossil record doesn't record the change. That is, the fossil record provides no evidence for the rapid process. And so the problem with this idea is at least threefold. Number one, the theory admits by definition that there's no empirical evidence that the rapid change occurred, making the theory what? Irrational. The whole idea is merely a wild assertion based on the assumption that creation can't be true. I won't accept God. There's never been such an evolutionary process witnessed, of course. As according to evolutionists, their own definition of science, punctuated equilibrium, is unscientific, and it isn't natural because it doesn't happen in nature. One could just as easily say, fairies exist, they float around inside of my eyeballs right now, but you can't see them. I have just as much evidence for that as punctuated equilibrium. And I think maybe more evidence for my idea than yours. It's a blind faith. Number two, second problem. It admits that there's insufficient direct evidence in the fossil record to prove evolution as Darwin defined it, and which is the dominant belief today. Number three, it concedes that the geologic record has supported what creationists have always contended should be the case if creation is true. It verifies creationist predictions. It's amazing to me, people like Bill Nye, when he squared off against Ken Ham, one of his big arguments, creationists can't make predictions. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We can do science. We can take what the Bible says and make predictions that are verified clearly, and the fossil record is an excellent example of that. The fossil evidence indicates that creature kinds have remained constant since creation, with only small varieties evolving over time, with strict narrow boundaries, with no evidence that those creatures can change into another kind. And so when fossils appear in the geologic strata, they're fully formed and functional species. They're not transitional creatures evolving between kinds. That's what the Christian model predicts, and that is exactly what the geologic column reveals. What evolutionists call abrupt appearance, which they concede is a sweeping trait of the fossil record. This isn't just random, strange anomalies here and there. Abrupt appearance is a sweeping trait, meaning every time you see creatures in the fossil record, they appear abruptly without any kind of evolutionary history. The first major explosion of fully functional species without any evolutionary history found in the geologic column at the very beginning of the fossil record is called the Cambrian explosion, and they go to great lengths to try to deal with this. Consider what Dawkins said about this. The Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Why? Well, because that's exactly what we'd predict. It's a verified prediction of creation, the creation model. It once again shows you we have the better model, not them, and yet they proclaim, we got the fossils, we win. Okay, that's just ignorance. They don't know what they're talking. People that say that are either bald-faced lying to people, or they just are ignorant. They don't really know the truth on this. Atheistic evolutionist Blair Scott, communications director of American Atheists Incorporated, he said in his debate with Kyle Butt, one of our guys at AP, he said, if I take the Cambrian explosion on its own, the logical conclusion I would draw is, wow, it was created. All right? But then he went on to say, the problem is there's all this other evidence around it that creationists ignore. Okay, wait a minute. What evidence are you talking about? Okay, well, all the evidence that they give to support evolution. Are we ignoring that? No, I just systematically refuted it. Okay, so what does that mean? The Cambrian explosion proves creation based on his own words. Well, I could spend time going through each of these, by the way, individually, and it would take another probably 20 minutes. We're not going to do that. But look at that dude with his 12 gauge. That took a long time to make that animation, I just want to say. That's one of my favorite ones. Anyway. So, you know, just because these fossils are not evidence of evolution, it doesn't mean you are not going to continue to encounter evolutionists who cite these things. They either haven't heard the truth, they've dismissed it, or they've ignored it. All right, back to our chart. So we're looking at all the alleged evidences of evolution, and one by one they're being shown to be wrong or weak at best. Now we've looked specifically at the fossil evidence for human evolution and seen that it is woefully lacking. All the while, again, the creation model has no problem with the evidence. It's in perfect harmony with science. Let's see here. All right, so returning to this chart. You know, first you look at this chart, young people are probably intimidated. Oh man, look at that. They got 24 fossils in this brazen, arrogant statement, this scoffing, confident. And there's something about that, even if it's not true. If somebody says something with confidence in a scoffing way, young people, you're going to feel intimidated by that. That's why you see God warn you about scoffers. And you especially see him, 2 Peter 3, it specifically talks about people that will scoff at you over creation and the flood. I mean, you're warned. That's what you're going to have. And you got to just deal with that. Don't let it intimidate you. So you always can dig into the evidence. You never have anything to be afraid about. You know, just look at the evidence. What does the evidence say? Well, the first thing you see, this actually isn't 24 fossils. It's 12. Because frontal and profile shots of each fossil are shown, one above the other. Second, you see from their own documentation that they've got a modern chimp and a modern Homo sapiens at the start and end of the lineup, respectively, serving as your starting and ending point. So an admittedly modern chimp and a modern man, of course, are not proof of evolution. So we're really talking about 10 fossils that, according to this chart, gives the proof for this bold statement. All right, so we look at the next fossils. The next two are designated Australopithecus africanus. These are being placed by, again, more and more prominent evolutionists in a side branch of the evolutionary tree that has nothing to do with man, including at D.C., at Washington, D.C., in our National Museum of Natural History. The next two fossils are designated by evolutionists as Homo habilis, which are believed by some to be the same as Australopithecus africanus and therefore not even an intermediate stage towards humans. But also, we have evidence that Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens lived at the same time, and therefore that doesn't fit the evolutionary model, where you should have evolution, then extinction of the less fit species. Otherwise, the species doesn't need to evolve if it's already good enough to stick around. So Homo habilis is not a missing link. We did look at handyman briefly as well today, which is an example of that. The next is Homo ergaster, which the evolutionists, including the ones that put this very chart together, consider to be morphologically the same as Homo erectus, which is morphologically the same as Homo sapiens. And so no proof of human evolution there. The next fossil is Homo heidelbergensis, a species based on the Rhodesian man and Heidelberg man fossils, which again are morphologically the same as Homo sapiens, only bigger in the case of Heidelberg man. The next three are Homo neanderthalensis, so Neanderthal man. All right, and remember that these guys are both genetically and in their visual appearance too, their physical appearance, exactly the same as modern man. So this is not a transitional creature either. And the final fossil is Cro-Magnon man, which we saw is actually not only morphologically the same as modern man, also genetically as well, we now know. So no missing link here either. And so the fossil evidence for the evolution of man from ape-like ancestors simply isn't there. So we need to change this chart up a little bit, don't we? Let's see here. All right. So I'll need to take down the books and all tomorrow, but I want to highlight to you a few other items. We got lots of media available for you back there and on our website. We've got hundreds and hundreds now of videos. We've been making lots of 2 to 5 minute videos to really try to appeal to the younger generations. But we also have these more extensive video series that are available online or as a DVD. Truth Be Told is Kyle and Eric's version of the evolution dinosaur type seminar. Behold the Lamb is a DVD series on the deity of Christ and showing the fact that you can prove that Jesus lived and then also know what the Bible teaches about him being God, which is being, I'm really surprised how much people that would consider themselves Christians don't view Jesus as the Son of God. I've been shocked by that. I was going through the Fishers of Men course, and so as I'm going talking to people and asking them the questions you're supposed to ask them, how many people I ran into that believed Jesus lived, but they didn't believe he was the Son of God. They believed in the Bible. They didn't know this. Like that was a new concept to them. So that's just not being taught, the deity of Christ. That's one of the pillars, of course, of our faith. And then this series on the inspiration of the Bible. Mike Houtz is a member of the church who's a NASA PhD nuclear engineer from MIT, just received their most prestigious medal award, from NASA. And he's got a series that he does showing that evolution is religion, not science. Answering Atheism is Kyle's series responding to those atheistic arguments, but in video forms. These all would be great for classes, for example. Islam, my dad's series on teaching you, if you don't have time to read the book, this series tells you, what is Islam, what is the Quran, who is Muhammad, how do we know that Islam is not right? His Silencing of God series has been very popular for years, as well as the sequel to that, America's Most Pressing Concern, showing the truth about America's founding and its founders. Is the Bible Reliable is basically the DVD form of Eric's Anvil Rings books that responds to alleged contradictions in the Bible and teaches how to respond to those and think through those on your own. So good principles on that. Kyle's debates that he has done, he actually is slated to debate Michael Shermer this fall at Faulkner University. And I've quoted from Michael Shermer multiple times already in this seminar, so this will be a big one for him to square off against him. Dad has a one-session DVD on the question of separation of church and state with regard to the founders' intention. Has the Bible been corrupted? This is such an important topic. One of the big arguments that atheists try to use is, hey, even if the Bible was originally inspired, we don't have the original copies of it. How do we know that the Bible has been transmitted faithfully over the centuries? And they say, hey, the Bible's got hundreds and hundreds of disagreements when you look at the manuscripts. And so we got to be ready to deal with that subject as well, and that is a DVD series on that. Pleasing God is in worship, addressing changes that have been going on in the church with regard to worship. This is the DVD that is kind of the abbreviated version of this seminar from this weekend. It's probably about half the amount of material I cover here. This is not an AP product, but I highly recommend it. Who all has seen Is Genesis History? Raise your hand. Just one of you? Really? You got to check this out if you have not. This is the leading creation scientists. These are the guys that I go into the field with and study with. And this actually came out in theaters and was it's powerful because it's these scientists talking about creation and the powerful evidence for creation in the flood. So I highly recommend it. They even, the guys that put it together sent it to me to review and check it out and make sure that I was cool with it so that I would feel like I could recommend it to people. And so I can wholeheartedly recommend it in that form, the form that came out online. They're actually working on the sequel to that. It's supposed to come out in the next few months, and I'm excited about that. There's a story behind it. I'll go ahead and tell you that real quick. You may have heard about this. One of the leading creation geologists, his name is Andrew Snelling. He's an Australian guy, but he's up at Answers in Genesis, where the Ark Encounter is in northern Kentucky, which I also highly recommend if you ever go up there. In fact, I lead tours for congregations that want to go up there and do that. But he's one of the geologists up there, and he was trying to get permission to go out to Grand Canyon to study one of the folded rock stratas. It's out there, I think at Carbon Canyon, there's some folded strata. And so if you have strata and all of a sudden it bends 90 degrees and goes straight up into the sky, that's a problem from a uniformitarian perspective, because you can't, what happens if you try to bend a rock? It breaks. So if you've got folded strata, that tells you something catastrophic happened while all those strata were soft and it bent it all at one time. So it would show that the entire geologic column was formed rapidly and by some kind of massive event that involved a lot of water because it had to have been soft, and that you had tectonic activity going on that was catastrophic. So it would be major evidence for creation. Now, what the evolutionists have always said is, well, if you reheat the rock, then you could bend it like that. Well, okay, if you reheat it, it's going to become metamorphic. So nobody has studied the Carbon Canyon rock to see if it's metamorphic or sedimentary. So Andrew Snelling wanted to go study it, and they wouldn't let him. So they sued the government over it, and he got permission to go. And so the follow-up to his Genesis history is him giving you the results of that study and showing you it's sedimentary rock. So I'm excited about that. That's because what are they going to do? I mean, that's pretty powerful evidence that we're right about that, and Grand Canyon was formed rapidly. All right, Dismantling Evolution Seminar. This is actually members of the church that are scientists that do some work for us, and I just got several of us together, including a Hebrew linguist, to just in one weekend very succinctly deal with the question of evolution and building the creation model kind of all at once, and not nearly as systematic as what we're doing, but hitting some of the highlights, but with several of us doing it. So it really turned out well because Joe DeWeese is a biochemist, so he deals with the origin of life. Mike House, nuclear engineer, he deals with the question of time and the dating methods. Branyan May, the astrophysicist, deals with the Big Bang. I deal with thermodynamics. And then Justin Rogers deals with the Hebrew of Genesis 1. So it really turned out really well, very scholarly and so forth. Be aware, though, we have all kinds of other videos available on our website, lots of free stuff, several series of short videos that can be used and so forth, and promoted, of course, online. Sharing these on Facebook and so forth can be a great evangelistic effort. We have a couple audio books. These just have not done real well, so we haven't done any more of these. We have a couple books that are read professionally by a guy that's a member of the church and does that. Our Christian Evidences show for kids, I'd mentioned to you, Digger Doug's Underground. Still popular after 15 years or whatever it is. I mentioned to you that I made a list of like 200 different memory verses for the teenagers to learn. Well, I started making songs for every one of these songs and other things that I wanted kids to learn in preparation for those teen years. And so at our congregation on Sunday nights, I do a kids prep thing where we work on memory work, and the congregation's there too, participating as well. And so they're memorizing all these things on Sunday nights, and then when they get to the teenage years, we talk about how they're useful. All right, so our next session, it's our fourth of the day, right? So we'll deal with the dating methods, not romantic dating, but radiometric dating, the evidence that is used to try to prove an old Earth. So we'll look at that next, and then we'll have that important session wrapping it all up and really getting to, it's more a Bible side of things, getting to what's really going on. Why are there so many people that accept this, and see what the Bible has to say.